So congratulations.
Thank you.
This is such an exciting, the last time I talked to you, you were actually on the podcast for my
That's right.
book.
We
right?
had so much fun.
We did.
We did.
And my book also came in a moment of rage.
Yes.
In response to the election of
The
Sweet Potato
person,
Saddam, as
yes.
my friend Michael Arsenault calls him.
Oh, that's very funny.
And so can't really think of a better topic right now. To be thinking and talking about. After the election, I think about all of the different feelings I had, the sadness, the depression, the therapy, all the things that I had to do, but it was rage that like kept rearing its ugly head. So of all of those things, because I think you had been working and thinking about this book for
a long time.
For a long time.
Yes.
Was there one thing that happened that made you realize you wanted to do this book in particular?
So I'd probably, not kidding, written 20 book proposals over 4 years, and I kept rewriting them, and then finally I wrote one right after the election, and I thought, wow, I'm really mad, and I didn't control that in the proposal, and I don't know how that's going to go, and maybe I shouldn't have done that, and we'll just see. And then I got a call from my editor, and she said, you know, when you're angry, no one wants to put that down. And I really think, and I'm like, oh, good, like we can just do that thing. And so it happened very quickly after that, actually, because it was kind of liberating. I wasn't really ready to allow myself to do that. And there was something about the election that was a sort of, oh, well, fuck it, just do it, because we've got nothing left here. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I think that was it was very unifying.
It was totally unifying, and very quickly.
Yeah. Because I was just, and a lot of my rage was almost like, some of it was misdirected. Like I would like go to parties and someone would be like, oh, but Bernie, and I'm like, ah! And then like I had to leave, like I'd have to excuse myself because it was like this inappropriate expression
That's very
of rage.
Funny. Yeah. I think when someone said Bernie to me, actually my husband and children were like, oh, just don't do that.
Yeah.
Like, just let's not do that now.
Like, this is a trigger word.
This is a trigger word, yeah. I know, it's funny. But yeah, there was a lot of despair.
Yeah.
I remember after the election for about 2 weeks, no matter where I went, what meeting I went to, there were women crying or having just cried or were about to cry. So, and I couldn't understand why the men were not equally in despair at all times. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, why were we so, like, why are we this angry? Like, why did the Women's March happen? Because it really, I think it was a breaking point in a lot of ways where, certainly for me, I'm a 20-year feminist activist. I think one of my employees said something like, I walked out, like I came in like from the Javits Center, what I call the feminist zombie apocalypse.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
And of people crying, and I walked out, and I came back to my team so unprofessional. I said, everything I've worked for is meaningless. Locked myself in my office.
That's right. You're like, it's done, it's over.
They were all like, should we go home? Like
that was the despair, right?
Yeah.
Because you thought, oh my God, I know so many people working so hard, and then there was this immediate need to strategize and recalibrate.
Yeah.
Literally to say, okay, who's going to do what? Who's going to be the good cop? Who's going to be the bad cop? Who's going to be forward-facing? Who's going to be? It was immediate. And then everybody passed around the Heritage Foundation strategy book. That was the next thing that happened, to see exactly what was going to happen next, which has been pretty accurate. Yeah.
So, I mean, I have to wonder if on a certain level, and you talk about this in the book, was it a tipping point in that, like, we'd already had that rage just below, and that kind of gave us a moment to
Yes, I think,
embrace it?
like I was talking this morning, and a lot of people's response when they haven't read the book or they just hear the word anger is, their response is, we don't need more anger in the world, and we don't need more anger in the United States. And I'm like, well, that's nice for you. Because we have this anger. The question is, what are we going to do with it? Where is it? And when I hear someone say that, what I mainly hear is, we don't want to know what you know. That's how it gets tessellated in my brain. I'm like, okay, well, what is it about what I'm saying I know that makes you so uncomfortable? And so I think of Audre Lorde, who said, there's so much anger and information, which is how I start the book. And I really think that the anger is a Trojan horse for looking at those issues.
Yeah. So what I really appreciate about this book is when I think about all of the gender studies, you know, I mean, we've known each other for a long time through feminist media, and, you know, so much of the motivator of some of the work that we've done has been rage-based, but it's very rare that people talk about anger outside of this like flippant way of like, oh, well, that's just like an angry woman, right? What I really appreciate about the book is it's this very well thought out meditation on the kind of implications of this, of the fact that we sideline women's anger and we don't kind of create a space for it. And I think about like Audre Lorde, I go to that when I'm really emotional, but I've actually never read anything that's just, you know, well, actually there's, you know, a socio-political
aspect
and
to
biological
this.
Piece of it. So you start the book out, there's this really remarkable scene with your mother where you see her throwing china, an otherwise well-behaved woman.
Yes.
Tell us about...
I have cousins here who know my mother.
So tell us about, like, set the context of that scene and kind of what happened before and after.
So it's pretty funny, actually. I was maybe 14 or 15, and I walked into the kitchen, which was on a second floor, and had a terrace outside, and she was standing out there with a stack of plates, and she was throwing them like Frisbees. She literally just tossing them, and this is not a normal thing to see.
And it's her wedding china.
It's just, well, the other thing that's interesting is over the years, my mother loves China, and so which I find an interesting commentary on domesticity, because there was China for certain things. And certain people use certain China, and you use certain China at certain times, and there's a lot in that, right? So she's standing there, and she's throwing these things off, and they're flying through the air, and then they're crashing. And there's one, and then another, and then another. And she comes back in, and she goes, "Well, how was your day?" And you really need to know my mom, who's about 5 feet tall, incredibly full of energy, one of the kindest people I know. And you need to know all of that to know how mad she was. And so I thought, well, she really doesn't want me to ask how her day was. So I'm just going to do my homework. But it was a perfect example of how we just didn't talk about anger at all. She wasn't going to talk about it. I wasn't going to talk about it. She didn't explain it. It was something she did in isolation. I never knew why. 40 years later, I asked. And she said, she burst out laughing. She goes, "I threw a lot more plates than you ever saw." And so I said, "Well, do you remember that? Like, do you remember that plate throwing?" And she did. And what she described was, I think, a situation very typical to women who are in heterosexual marriages, particularly very traditional. My parents were both Catholic. She had converted to Catholicism. And she said, you know, I was really tired of working hard all day, looking really nice at the end of the day, no matter what. My mother looked incredibly beautiful at the end of the day. She said, and I'd have dinner prepared, and then your father just wouldn't show up until he felt like it. And I was like, and so you threw the plates? She goes, yeah, I threw the plates. And so we talked about that because she did something a lot of women do, which is to externalize the anger in a way that doesn't infringe on the relationship. It doesn't actually help. There was nothing about throwing the plates that changed my father's behavior or made demands on him. It taught me a lot of lessons, like don't talk about the anger, it's really destructive, like all of these things, you know. So yes, that's how I started the book.
So yeah, I want to talk about the gender piece of this and kind of, you know, you have that really great anecdote about your daughter who would build the castle and the little boy in the school.
The rape analogy.
Yes.
Yes.
And I'm not going to give every anecdote because you have to buy the book and you're going to read the book. But
that was another good one.
That's a really good analogy. Can you talk about that a little? How just like what I found really fascinating was even the parents being like, "Oh, he's just a boy." Like
it was really, you couldn't have made it up. And so the more I tried to deal with my own anger and figure it out, and by the time I started writing, I wrote as a feminist in college. I started a feminist magazine at Georgetown, which was kind of hard. It was very Catholic. I couldn't get funded. I mean, there was all this stuff, and then I stopped, and then I went back to it. By the time I went back to it, I was really livid. But I would have said to you, "Oh, I'm not angry. I'm never angry." And so I had these little children. I had 3 children under the age of 3, and that was very stressful and very hard. And they started school, and I realized, and my husband realized, that despite our best efforts, he's very liberal, very progressive, incredibly supportive, co-parents. The systems in place were just designed to ignore all of that and to just reinforce and reinforce and reproduce all of these forms of discrimination. And so in preschool, I was really fun at circle time. And so she would build this castle every morning, and this boy would run up to it and push it down. And his parents were there, and we were there, and no matter what, they never intervened. They never stopped him before the fact. And so we talked about it. She was very angry. She got increasingly angry. What she really couldn't understand is why no one did anything. Why could he just do this? Because she would never do this. And so we strategized. And so she did all of the things that you might want someone to do. She politely used her words. She stopped. She kind of body blocked him because she could do that. She's very tall. That didn't work. She moved. This is something that drives me crazy. She moved where she was playing. And his parents kept saying things. They were textbook boys will be boys apologies for not holding a child accountable. He's a boy, he's so destructive, he can't help himself. It's so tempting, and in my head, of course, I'm going rape, 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 rape. And that's not something you can spit out in like a preschool, right? Like you're really setting these kids up. And
see you at the parent-teacher meeting.
At
like,
the parent-teacher meeting, I'm like, this is rape culture, right? But what was really interesting about this whole thing was there was another little boy, and I didn't actually write this in this. I've written about it before. And that little boy, he really wanted to do the same thing, but his parents had really taught him. And so he went up to her one day and he said, you know, I think it'd be fun if we broke it down. And she was like, I think it would be fun too. And I'm like, oh, sex. Like, I'm like, they're only 4. But what that really was emblematic of was that, and this is true in the United States especially, right? There are all these interesting studies about preschool preparedness and gender and children, and one in particular from the University of Oregon sticks in my head because they looked at children and their preparedness in 3 or 4 Asian countries and the United States, and they found that in the United States in particular, people don't think boys can control themselves. And so what they think becomes what actually happens, and boys are not held accountable for controlling themselves, and we go from there. And so little girls are more prepared, generally speaking, because they are expected to be prepared. And so there are all kinds of incidents that I'm sure many of us can recall that I've seen over and over again as a parent, which include things like, you know, little children sitting around and personal space being violated. And instead of teaching respect for that space or talking about what are essentially, you know, preschool citizenship rights, right? Like people have their rights and they have their space, and very often if there's a child, and it's not always a boy doing this to a girl, but it's frequently the case, that is poking or stroking or hugging or getting way too close, they will move the child who is being targeted and move that child to like another class if she's disturbed. And that really sends the wrong message, right? There's nothing about that dynamic that's particularly helpful to anybody. But that's how early it starts. And as it pertains to anger, even in infancy, we know that adults are much more inclined to attribute negative, angry behaviors and words to children they think are boys. But with girls, they'll take the same behaviors and they'll describe them in terms of sadness or sort of a kind of anxiety, agitation. Same behavior, but totally different set of words and expectations.
Yeah. So it's hard to kind of separate that, you know, this idea of like how we're socialized differently to be, you know, women, we literally don't have the permission to express our anger. As men, you're allowed to. It's permissible to a certain extent.
Some men, as you know, because then we'll get into, I mean, if you really get into the racial and ethnic aspects of that, it's not the fact that most men can express anger. Right. I mean, President Obama could not express anger. That's right. You know, the anger translator skits that we all laughed at were real, you know, and so we see that very early on too. I mean, young black girls are penalized for behaving in ways that young white boys are actually being protected for. And so what we designate as leadership in one child is seen as disruptive and needing discipline in another.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that just brought to my mind another example of this week. We had two really prominent examples of Black women's anger in the media, or like women of color's anger in the media. First was Serena at the US Open final, expressing anger, doesn't use a curse word, doesn't, it's not even, John McEnroe like showed clips of himself. He posted clips of himself.
Like, and Djokovic, there's
calling umpires son of a bitch and all this and not getting penalized for it. While you were watching that, what were you thinking? Even her body language was so, like, you could tell that she had to lower her voice when the referees came out. You could see, I thought that, actually, what it reminded me of, oddly enough, was when Uma Thurman described her Me Too response. Yes. And she kept saying, I'm not going to use anger and I'm not going to talk about anger, but every ounce of her body was thrumming with rage. And so there's all that sort of tensile quality to the interaction. But what's interesting to me about what happened on the court was it's always the responses. And there are people who just want to focus on the moment and without the context and without the history and without the accrued effects of what's going on, and just pinpoint that moment as though it exists in a vacuum. And that's not particularly helpful. I'm still amazed by two things. One is that she was levied the largest fine ever for verbal abuse. And we've all heard the verbal abuse examples that defy any characterization of what she did as the most extreme. And the second is that there are a group of umpires, referees now, saying that they will not officiate at her games. And to me, that's just, okay, we're going to pick up our toys and go. Yeah. And it's it reminds me of the social sciences, where economics became so prominent because women started to be successful in all of these other social science fields. And men literally just were like, we're out of here. We're going to go do that other thing, and we're going to be really hostile to you, and we just want this space. Yeah. It's interesting when I was watching, when she's so gracefully kindly asked the crowd to stop booing for Naomi Osaka. When she was crying, when she was doing it, that rage cry, like I was like, oh, that is so, I can relate to that so much. Mm-hmm. How much of, and you talk about this in the book, is women's emotion, the way that we express it. People are like, oh, well, she's sad. She's like upset about that.
She's sad,
it's like, no, these are rage tears. Like my tears will melt through the ground right now. I'm so angry.
But that's an interesting thing too, because the other thing that happened, of course, is people are like, well, as a mother, how are you going to explain that to your child, right? And she says, as a mother, and I think that's really common in the culture, because we're willing to be forgiving of women's anger if they admit that they understand their primary role in that very sex-segregated schema. And so as a mother, as a nurturer, and so politically we see that in the temperance movement, we see it in, Moms Against Drunk Driving, the Children's Defense Fund, women who are really pressing for gun regulations. And so it's almost as though we just have to say, fine, we know, now let us say our piece. And when women do that, they're given a little more flexibility to be angry, because they've sort of said, okay, fine, I get it, I'm not going to transgress in that way. But tears are really interesting too, because I think that particularly in interpersonal interactions, women cry out of rage, but it also then confirms a lot of femininity. I'm sad, or I'm weak, or I'm vulnerable, or I'm not threatening you in this certain way. And it just is something that happens, it's something we are socialized to do. And I think a lot of men might be surprised to hear that actually I'm crying because I am enraged. I'm not crying because I'm sad. I'm actually so angry I can't get words out. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also, I think it's in interpersonal relationships and relationships with men, it's almost like a joke, like when your girlfriend's angry, right? Or your wife is angry. Oh, she's angry because like I didn't come to dinner on time, or it's acceptable for your mother to be angry because like you didn't clean up your toys, or that type of rage that is acceptable, that's more gendered.
Mm-hmm. Nurses and teachers.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing too that was kind of, some of the book is sort of depressing, but I sort of let that peak. I'm like, okay, peak depression, now we get out of there, right? But the thing that women, there are not a lot of studies about this, but this was really arresting. When you ask women what they anticipate most, what they fear the most in response to their anger, it's not violence, it's not someone else getting angry at them, it's mockery. And that to me was remarkable because they anticipate being dismissed and being made fun of and being belittled. That's the number one thing they say. And I think that women say it because that is their experience. Yeah. And so even we use minimizing language. We say we're irritated or irked, or we say I'm stressed. And I said this in the book, I'm like, how many times do we say I'm stressed when what we want to really say is I'm really mad, I'm very angry about something. So we just learn to work around with our language. And we know what the mockery, I mean, we know all the language, even from being little girls. You know, you go from being a bratty little princess to a diva, to an over-emotional teen, to a high-maintenance woman, you know, and then all of this sort of, she's a bitch, she's a nag, all of those. And then they all have their ethnic flavors, you know.
No, absolutely. And yeah, the other example from this week was Cardi B throwing a shoe at Nicki Minaj. And which the thing that frustrated me about that was, first of all, I missed the party. I was definitely at New York Fashion Week. And I was at a show that Cardi was supposed to show up to, and she didn't. Well, first of all, that's obviously, it's like they're having a rap beef, and like men have had rap beefs for the beginning of time. I mean, that's like how the industry propelled itself for a very long time.
It continues.
But between these two women, it's like that's what I want. I want this to like inspire creativity between the two of them. But it's, you know,
are you hopeful that that's going to happen?
Yeah, not super hopeful. But you know, it was really like, it was a cat fight, right? It was the way that it was kind of covered. But I actually appreciated, and you know, Cardi really speaks from the heart. I feel like that's why people like her so much. She's super authentic. And she went home, she didn't apologize. She put a note up on Instagram being like, that's what you do for messing with, you know, like she was just like, she doubled down.
Unapologetic.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, and I actually thought, and I think that that's kind of what I appreciated about it, because like, even I felt uncomfortable. I was like, come on, girl, like, it's Nicki, like, don't go against Nicki. Everybody knows she's from Queens, like, come on. But like, you know, but it's like,
it's
that
kind
actually,
of important, right? Like, it sounds ass backwards, but it's sort of important to see that, see examples of that. Which we see all the time with men. Yeah. And so we have the catfight narrative, and then we also have the forgiveness. Always forgive and forgive and forgive and forgive. And I'm like, nah. Yeah. No, not until you're ready. Yeah. Because there's such incredible pressure to forgive. Yeah. And I'm like, but you're not actually forgiving. You're resenting. Like, you're saying I forgive, but then you're resentful. And the thing about resentment is it's really backwards looking. Yeah. You don't look forward when you resent something. You just keep looking backwards and you ruminate, and that just makes you sick. Which is the other thing, like how much when people say to me, well, you're adding rage, and I'm like, no, the rage really is here. It's really material in people. It's material in our bodies. And so all of these ailments that we call women's sicknesses, I'm not saying anger makes these sicknesses happen, or not being angry is going to cure these illnesses, but anger is such a central feature to so many of the issues, women's issues, that we encounter. So things like anxiety and depression and eating disorders, and even like chronic pain. You know, women all over the world have much higher rates of chronic pain. And one of the surprising things I found out was that anger modulation, like being able to make meaning out of your anger, significantly improves your ability to deal with pain. And that quality of making meaning has all kinds of other health benefits that we never associate with emotional life.
Yeah, reading it really made me think about how much art and music and writing and creativity we have yet to see because of women's suppressed anger.
Yes, but also I just think there's so much there that we don't associate with women's anger that we should. So I had a wonderful conversation with Janelle Manai, and we talked extensively about this because there is in music, for example, there's so many examples of women writing music that is fueled by anger, but it's joyful, right? Like I made a playlist when I was writing this book because I wanted to hear other angry women who had found joy. And it was fun, you know, because I like the music, and we just don't associate it with women's anger. And so in the middle of writing this book, I think I heard Bono say, there's really no space for angry young men anymore. And he just said it. And I was like, huh, okay, I guess, no. But there's all this music, and if you listen to the words and if you pay attention to how the women got to the music, it's through anger. But they've just transformed it into this thing that actually creates solidarity for women. Because we all have songs we associate with anger. We know what those songs are. They have a place in our memories and in our history, and you know, they're fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think right now, you know, because of women's anger, we're having the resistance. I mean, I think the face of the resistance is women. I mean, Teen Vogue is talking about revolution.
Teen Vogue is so great. Like, honestly, I don't know how many people here are not reading Teen Vogue. But if you're not reading Teen Vogue, it really should be the first thing you read. It's really, really amazing.
Yeah, and so we do these annual summits where, you know, teen girls come together and, you know, kind of organize and talk to each other about different issues that we're covering, you know, everything from celebrity to politics. But this last one was focused on politics, and it was really exciting, but also, you know, I feel like our work is not done yet in terms of how much rage these teen girls have.
Right.
In terms of what's happening in the political system right now and in the world around them, and not having enough outlets. So let's talk about young women and rage.
Like, the thing that really is so disturbing is how easily girls' political ideas and anger are recategorized into things that just evaporates, right? And so I write a lot about dress codes because they're easy for people to understand, and very often when, generally speaking, it's girls, but dress codes reinforce all kinds of other things like heteronormativity and a lot of racism. And what happens with girls is that, let's say there's a girl and she protests and the headline will read, yoga pants dominate school debate. And you're like, actually, no, she's talking about double standards and having these very shaming experiences in public and being expected to wake up in the morning and think first and foremost, what's going to turn these men on? What's going to turn, like, you know, a 13-year-old girl doesn't do that until she's kind of told by her school, actually, you shouldn't wear those clothes. Like, that's a really not a good idea, and we want you to wear this shame suit, which still happens, right? And so I think that that's a good example because what those students are protesting is political. And they're making these sort of statements, but they're never taught the language. They don't have a framework. And what's so frustrating about that is each community, each school recreates the wheel every time. And so it would be great if it happened much earlier in the process, that we had these kinds of conversations. And I think talking to them about anger and the way anger is a form of self-defense, because to me the central issue, particularly for girls, particularly for young girls, is that when which we do, associate anger with masculinity, and we strip anger from the notion of femininity, we strip them of the ability to act in self-defense, to speak in self-defense, to assert their dignity or rights or anything else. And what was interesting about what happened at the US Open, of course, in so many of the good things that I've read, was this idea that she was simply defending herself and defending her honor, which is something we kind of understand as a masculine quality, but don't pay much attention to. It's sort of immanent in femininity is this idea that you don't have to have dignity. So.
You have a really beautiful vignette about getting really upset because your daughter at 13 asks to go get ice cream and you get
that was bad.
Angry about it. But you say some really powerful things to her. Will you share some of the things about, because we talk a lot about preparing women for the male gaze or for how they're going to be treated in the world. And, you know, I imagine as a mom, there's a conflict there because there's the generic advice that you know is slut-shamey and bad and not feminist, but you're also a parent and you're
worried.
You're worried.
Right.
So how did you navigate that? And can you share a little bit of what you said to her?
So what happened is that when my oldest daughter was about 13, she's tall. All my children are much taller than I am. And so she looked a lot older than 13. And she was very independent and adventurous. And it just happened that one day, it was late in the afternoon and we live in the city, and she said, hey, can I just go? I want to go get ice cream. And when I turned around and I saw her, I was like, oh shit. She looks 18, 19, 20. And I hadn't had an in-depth conversation with her. I've been not very different from the things I'm saying now, she's heard her whole life, but it's different when you have to say, actually, you need to be aware, you need to be alert. And so I actually didn't understand what was happening in the moment. I just excused myself and I went into a bathroom and I sobbed. And then I thought, well, hold on a minute, what is going on here? I was so mad I was shaking. And I was mad because I realized that now I had to tell her these things. And even though she knew these things, I had to say them out loud. And I had to, in some ways, re-experience what I remembered from absorbing what the threats meant. And what they meant was that I had to shrink the world immensely. And that made me profoundly sad, but it really made me angry. And actually what happened is my husband came home and I said, hey, I'm stopping the work that I'm doing because I'm at this age where I can do that, and I'm going to make a financially really probably unwise decision for us, but I'm going to start writing all the time, because it's all I can think to do. We have 3 children, I can't leave, I can't take another kind of job, but this is what I'm gonna do because it's all I can think to do. And so I did have that conversation with her, and we talked about some safety rules, and about a week later, and I should say this, at 13 she'd already been harassed. And I don't know, I'm just curious as to who remembers their first incident of harassment, right? And I was 9 the first time. I remember it very clearly because actually the boy who was 17 said he was going to rape me. It was in a schoolyard. This was not a subtle form of harassment. But where I lived in the Bahamas, harassment is constant. You can't walk down the street without someone saying something to you or grabbing you or following you. And it's not that intense in Washington, but it still exists, and it exists all over the world. And so about a week later, I said to her, okay, honey, well, you've been walking around all week since our conversation, and when we spoke, we talked about how you were going to think about, how you're going to sort of assess risk, because that's what we're talking about. And I said, well, how are you thinking about that? And she said, well, I think that if a person approaches me, if a man approaches me, and he says something, and I feel comfortable looking him in the eye and saying, and answering him or saying thank you or answering his question, then I'm not in danger. But if I feel that I cannot do that, then I feel I am in danger, which is something we all do automatically, never even thinking about it. But she was thinking quite consciously about it. And so can I take that to one other place?
Yes.
So she's 21 now, and we had this conversation again 3 nights ago, because she has recently graduated and come back from university and is very used to physical freedoms that are maybe not available to her in Washington the same way that they were where she was. And so she was walking home very late, and she texted and she said, "I'm walking home." And my husband said, "Well, do you think that's a good idea?" And I said, "Well, it doesn't really matter what we think. She has to decide if it's a good idea, and I trust that she has decided that it's a good idea because she has to do this all day, every day." And so she came home and she said, "Well, yeah, it was fine. It was very busy, and it was totally fine walk, and I felt very comfortable doing that." But in fact, my husband's response was he was protective. And I said, "Well, why are you worried tonight? Like, because you've been forced to consciously think about the fact that she's making these assessments?" And he said, "Yeah, that's right. It's totally inconsistent." But it's interesting because what happened after the election, when we were all so sad, was at one point my husband said, "Well, this sadness is really lingering in the house." And he was very upset too, but the 4 of us couldn't really shake it. And he said, "It's going to be okay." And I said, "Well, no, I don't really think so. I don't think it's going to be okay." And I said, "But I don't want you to interpret that as you have failed us. This is the issue with a lot of men. You haven't failed us because you haven't protected us. And the major issue if I had one insight that came out of this book that I hadn't contemplated fully, it was the degree to which when we tell these stories, when we talk about vulnerability or anger or any of the failures that affect our lives, for the men in our lives who love us and care for us, that becomes an issue of identity threat. And so I have a chapter on denial, and I have a chapter on silencing, and it's almost a reaction to thinking, I'm failing to do the job I'm supposed to do as a real man. And nobody can do that job. No man can follow the women that he loves 24 hours a day throughout their lives. Never gonna happen, will never work, right? So I think that the whole, a major part of this is rethinking how we can create this more healthy sense of masculinity that doesn't trade in women's vulnerabilities. Because both providing and protecting requires us to be vulnerable, either financially vulnerable or physically vulnerable. And as long as that is true, then you end up with the Aaron Sorkin letter. Do you remember the Aaron Sorkin letter? The Aaron Sorkin letter was like, we're gonna protect you. And I'm like, no, you're not. No, stop saying that. It's not gonna happen. So, but a lot of the anger that women feel comes from performances of masculinity. And that is consistent over and over and over again.
Yeah. So I want to turn it over to questions. But I also, when I was reading the book, I was telling you this before,
yes.
Have been going through some things, and I got really angry about something, and I hadn't felt that kind of rage in so long. Like the kind of rage that you're like, you can't fall asleep at night, and you wake up and you think about that, and it's like, usually it's a person, right? And you're like, I'm thinking about this person, and I'm angry as hell. And I was reading this book as I was going through it.
It was making you angrier.
Yeah. And I noticed that I kept having this impulse to explain away the rage and to be polite about it and convince myself that I wasn't angry. Yeah. And it was so perfectly timed because I was like, no, that I'm gonna be angry and I'm gonna let that anger go. And I just I started journaling, I was just I'm letting the rage go. And it actually helped. It ended up being a clarifying experience.
You spend so much energy trying not to pay attention to it.
Exactly. Yeah. And it helped me identify what was beneath that anger. And it wasn't just this kind of superficial thing. It was gave me information, and I think that's really how you conclude the book as well. And in terms of anger management is not what we want to get to, right? That's what we're always taught as women to how to manage your anger, how to make it polite. But it's really about the uses of it.
Yes, and honestly, I was thinking a lot about this anger management thing because so much of it is focused on this explosive anger, you know, that people have when they don't manage their anger. This is true, but I really think of it in terms of competence. How can you gain real competence with using this emotion? Because we just think of it as negative, but it is what, you know, the compassion is compassion. Anger is compassion. It's empathy. It's love. I mean, all of these things that we do are often driven by those emotions, hand in hand with anger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've got about 10 minutes for questions, so if you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll bring you the microphone.
Hi.
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 Hello.
So I haven't finished the book yet. I've started it and I can't wait. But a word that wasn't said tonight that I think is very relevant to this discussion is the word hysterical.
Yes.
And especially this past week, right? This is again in the news that the women who are upset about Kavanaugh are being hysterical rather than angry. And something else that I think about this is actually how harmful that word has been to women, that we were hospitalized and we had hysterectomies and oophorectomies, and so I'm wondering if you have an answer on how to fight back that our anger should be taken seriously rather than it hurting us in the public sphere.
Right, so I'm kind of hoping that you can take this book. Don't throw it at someone. I know, it's really heavy, you know. But I think that's really the crux of it, right? We have all this language that is really demeaning to women. And that is a prime example of that problem. And so, like, it has to happen on many levels. On one level, it's just personal. We have to use our own language to accurately describe the feelings that we have instead of minimizing them. There's a lot of minimization. It's like knee-jerk for me to minimize my anger. And then I stop and I think, no, actually, no, that's not irritating me. It's really enraging to me. And then the second thing is the structure of women's emotionality versus men's rationality and logic. I talk about that in the last chapter too, because we're designated the more emotional cohort of people, and then that emotionality is used against us as a weapon. And in fact, the problem is the sort of superstructure of the binary to begin with, and so you need to break that down as much as possible, but also acknowledge that anger is rational. There's nothing irrational about the emotion. It's a really kind of logical response to when bad things happen. And it's the signal, right? It's the signal that a bad thing is happening. So that's one level. And then the second level, which is what we do, and so many people in this room do, is fight to have stories told with accurate language, with positive framing that shift public understanding. And we have a huge problem with public understanding.
Well, I have the microphone.
Yes.
So.
Hi, girl. Hi, the mic.
We know each other.
Yes, we do.
You're amazing. Yes. So to pick up on Mia's question where you just left off, obviously you know in 2019 coming up here, we're going to have women running for president, hopefully. I think there are going to be a couple that declare. What do you think, has the narrative shifted all within the media on how they're going to interpret women's, they're going to say passionate or whatever. I mean, we already seen from Senator Harris's testimony that some said she was quite passionate. She was quite this. Like, it was more negative, just her asking regular questions back about Kavanaugh. So I wanted to see if you thought the needle had changed.
So I'm with the Women's Media Center. I'm on their board and I run a project called the Speech Project with the Women's Media Center, which is about online harassment and women's civic and political participation. And every year, the Women's Media Center does studies of basically the demographics of the media industry, which frankly, despite the best efforts of people, many of whom are also in this room, have remained stubbornly unchanged since roughly 1992. And I think that for many of us, part of the reason that we had this moment of explosive anger after the election was how slow mainstream media managers were to understand what was happening, despite the fact that many people had been saying what was happening over the course of many years. And then, you look as recently as this week or last week where somebody stands up who has had authority or legitimacy and says, we have a problem on our hands. And you're like, yes, we do. We have had a problem on our hands. And I wanted to start a listserv just called the Cassandras, right? Because you feel like you're banging your head against a wall. And so on the one hand, the thing, despite all the terrible harassment and everything we know about the cesspool that is the internet, it has given us the ability to speak in ways that are unprecedented. We have to deal with all of the shit that comes with that, but we can do that, and we can make media, and we can form networks, and they can be global, and that's really important. But in fact, we still have huge obstacles in the way stories are told and framed and the language that's used. So even in the case of the Women's Media Center, they have a guide called Unspinning the Spin that is a guide to non-sexist language, and now it's much more thoroughly intersectional in the way it deals with language. But it means that we have to spend a lot of time and effort trying to even get people to pay attention to that. And that's hard, especially when chaos reigns, Yes.
I loved many things about the book. One thing I found to be really compelling is the way you talk about the interplay between anger and fear, especially in women. And it brought back a memory, because one of the things I think you mentioned is that one female response sometimes to fear is giggling.
Yes.
And it's interesting, because I remember years ago when I was in college, a situation with a guy who I thought was a friend with basically attempted sexual assault, and I kept giggling uncontrollably.
You laughed, right?
I laughed.
Yeah.
I couldn't stop, and I was terrified. And so
Right.
if you could just talk
So
about
this is
that.
super interesting too. This idea, like very often, a lot of us write about sexual violence and sexual assault, particularly campus sexual assaults, and women who don't conform to the perfect victim are often blamed for what happens. And giggling is not perfect victimhood, right? Like, if you giggle in the face of threat, you must be enjoying yourself, right? That you laugh, you enjoy yourself, you laugh, right? But what's interesting is that there's actually a very interesting physiological difference between men and women when they face threat, and it makes sense. But when we talk about fight or flight, men are much more likely to have the physiological response that results in that, whereas women's physiological response, meaning neurotransmitters and all kinds of other things, is tend and befriend. And so when you couple that with our socialization, which is to put others at ease, to de-escalate the temperature of situations, you end up with a completely different response to threat. And you see that in cases of domestic violence. You see it in cases of intimate partner rapes. I mean, you see it with stranger encounters, on the street where a woman knows that she's smaller and that if she does the wrong thing, she could die. So it doesn't make sense to fight. And even laws pertaining to free speech and street interactions and street harassment, they're still really calibrated to a really kind of stupid old-fashioned idea that you have two men of equal size standing in a dark alley and that they're going to duke it out. That's just not the way we live. And so, yeah, we have these responses that enable us to adapt and survive, but are not recognized often in the law or in the culture or in media conversations about the problem.
We have time for one last question here.
Why do you think, well, if you agree with this assessment, that the right has been more effective in channeling anger, at least in like the past 5-10 years? I think like Tea Party or Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And maybe if you could talk also about how in the most recent election, obviously you had that shifting now with all these female candidates, but Hillary was the cool, rational one, and Trump was the emotional one, and that was sort of embraced by.
So that's two things, right? One is we know that power accrues to men who display anger, and powerlessness accrues to women who do. So that was clear in the case. I mean, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump could look deranged, unhinged, messy. It didn't really matter. They could thump things, they could throw things, they could do anything, and they could tap into populist anger very effectively. Whereas if a woman did the same thing, she would be disparaged. And that is clear from study after study after study after study. And so it happens in courtrooms, it happens in medical situations, it happens in politics. So every time somebody said, oh, she's so inauthentic, you'd think, well, what the hell? What is she going to do? If she does that, she's going to be punished. And if she does this other thing, she's going to be sort of, told that she can't be true to herself. Well,
Is there a way that we have all these female candidates running now?
right.
For them to go there without, to harness it in a way that it seems like, like you said,
So
that was always the critique of hers.
I think there is, but I think it's undeniable that we still live in an emotional culture that is not happy with that, right? And so we all walk this fine line. Everybody understands what the penalties might be if you express anger in those ways. So I think there are so many fights that have to be fought on many fronts, right? So we have to be calling out media. We have to be trusting other women. We have to not disparage other women when they do these things, which is why your Cardi B example, I'm like, yeah, that happened, right? And so it happened and it's done and now it exists, But there was something else that you said about the right leveraging anger. I think what they leveraged was money and strategy, and that they have been super effective at that, and that they had a very thorough, decades-long strategy, and that the left needs to get better about both of those things. And I think it's in the nature of the right to be more authoritarian. That's clear, right? We know that, and that it's been effective. I think the left is leveraging anger just fine right now, And was there a third part to your question? I think that was it. Yeah. Well, can I just say thank you to so many people here that I just want to, yeah. And thank you to you.